Bonjour tout le monde. Alors, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, my name is Alexandra Dorca and I'm the director of l'Alliance Française de Seattle. Thank you for joining us today for the second talk of our recently launched online conference program, les Rencontres de l'Alliance Française de Seattle. C'est très important. We will be 80 today to welcome with a great honor on behalf of l'Alliance Française de Seattle, le Consul Général de France à San Francisco, Monsieur Emmanuel Lebrun-Damiens. Monsieur le Consul Général, la parole est à vous.
Bonjour Alexandra. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you on Zoom. Unfortunately, I miss going to Seattle. I used to go to Seattle very often, and with the current circumstances, I can't leave San Francisco, and I'm sheltering in place. But I hope you are well as well as it is possible to be in the current circumstances. You were the first in the United States to be in this pandemic. You used to be at the beginning, the epicenter of the pandemic in the United States, and we always felt very close to you and to the French community in Washington State. So thank you very much to the Alliance and to Alexandra for organizing this series of conferences. I'm glad to take part in this series. Saturday was Europe Day. I don't know if you noticed. It's what we call Schuman Day, because in 1950, Schuman, who was the then French Foreign Affairs Minister, made a declaration, and it is considered as the first step of the European integration, this wonderful adventure of 70 years of integration in Europe, which brought the longest period of peace in Europe. So when Alexandra asked me which topic I wanted to cover during this conference, I thought perhaps we should do something about the European Union and assess where it is now and how it reacts to the crisis of the moment, which is the coronavirus crisis. I couldn't stress enough the seriousness of this crisis in Europe. Coronavirus has made 120,000 casualties in Europe. Europe is still the epicenter of the pandemic in the world. And the countries that suffer the most are Italy, Spain, and France, with a number of deaths around 26,000 in France and more than 30,000 in Spain and Italy. There are even more casualties on the other side of the English Channel in the UK. But as you know, the UK is not part of the EU anymore with Brexit. I'm sure you follow the news, and so you are well aware of the way the European Union reacts to not only the health crisis and also the economic crisis. And you've seen many negative news. Let's be frank on that. Perhaps to counterbalance this, I would like to look at it today with a different perspective, because I think the reality is more nuanced than many people think. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the scale of the health crisis and the economic crisis is huge and absolutely depressing. But in the way the EU is facing these challenges, there are things that work and things that are moving in the right direction, and this is the thing that I would like to present here. I have 3 points. The first one is about the health crisis response. The second one is about the monetary policy reaction, and the third one is about the budgetary policy reaction. It might seem technical, and things are always technical when you talk about the EU, but bear with me, you'll see it's possible to explain them in a not that technical way. So first point, the health response. Well, you have to have in mind that the EU is a very peculiar animal. It is the most ambitious example in the world of a transfer of sovereignty from states to a supranational body on a regional basis. So it means that on a number of policies, the EU member states decided to give their responsibility, their power to the European Union, that is to say, to European Union bodies, the Council, the Commission, and the European Parliament. And for some policies, the EU is entirely responsible, and member states don't have a responsibility anymore. It's the case, for example, for trade. I was a French negotiator at the United Nations in New York. When a negotiation was about trade, I was not allowed to take the floor. It was to the colleague from the European Commission to negotiate. It's the same for fisheries, it's the same for customs, it's the same for agriculture. However, health is not a policy where we ask the EU to take responsibility. Health, like culture or tourism, has been kept under the responsibility of national governments. And so many critics about the lack of preparedness of the EU in terms of testing capacity or availability of protective equipment have to be addressed not to the EU, but to national governments, because they are the one responsible. And what we've seen is that the EU has done much more than it was supposed to do in terms of coordination. Health ministers talk to each other all the time. They have meetings where they try to coordinate their response, and the EU tried to develop some norms in the way we can react to this health crisis. And of course, especially at the beginning, we saw a lack of solidarity between the member states, and it is sad when members of a bloc don't have the reflex to help each other the way they should. But we've seen also great acts of generosity between member states, and I will keep this image, of countries like Germany, like Luxembourg, like Romania, who hosted patients from Italy or France when our hospitals were reaching their capacity limit. So on the health response, since this presentation is really about the European Union, I think that it would be irrelevant to criticize the EU for the managing of the crisis itself. That is a responsibility of the member states. Moving now to the monetary policy. And this is a field where the EU clearly has a competence, full competence, and a huge responsibility in an economic crisis like this one. And here I can really say that the existence of the euro currency and the action of the European Central Bank have tremendously helped. When I was a teenager, which is not that long ago, each country in Europe had its own currency. And when we had downturn of the economy, when the economy was not going well, it was a catastrophe because financial markets were playing one currency against the other. We are putting the different countries in competition. Let's be clear. If today we had several currencies, if today we didn't have the euro currency, if today we didn't have the European Central Bank, the economic crisis we would have today in Europe would be way, way more serious. Why? Because the European Central Bank was able to make markets understand that it would do whatever it takes to keep interest rates low. And at a time when countries need to make fiscal stimulus and their debt is going to increase, they need to have low interest rates. Many people talk about the level of the debt, and that's an important topic for countries. But there's something even more important. It is the cost of the debt. And if interest rates are low and if people are confident that they are going to stay low, then it is way easier to make sure that you will be able to finance the economy, to make a stimulus to your economy, and not be totally overwhelmed by the debt you create. And without the euro, the interest rates in Europe today, in some European countries, will have increased very, very much. And this is something we don't see today. So we should realize today the benefit we have from the euro currency. And it was something hard, to convince 19 countries, because there are 19 countries in the Eurozone, to convince 19 countries to drop their currency, which is at the core of the existence of a country, was something very, very, very hard. And when you do it in time of peace or when the economy is okay, people just wonder, why would you do that? It's when you have a crisis like the one we have today that we realize how important it is. That was my second point about the monetary policy. My third and last is about the budgetary policy. Well, here it's different because the European Union doesn't have a central fiscal authority. The EU doesn't have a treasury. And the budget of the European Union is merely more than 1% of the European GDP. Still, in this crisis, the EU has been pretty reactive. 3 short points. First, on March 23rd, the EU finance ministers met and agreed to ease the EU fiscal rules. These rules limited the ability of member states to develop a fiscal stimulus of the scale required by the crisis. At the same meeting, they decided to allow exceptions to our rules on competition in order to authorize what we call state aid measures, when a government helps a company in particular, something which is not allowed in normal times, but which is very important in a crisis like this one. If someone had been in a coma between the beginning of January and now, and was waking up now, he would be very surprised by this reactivity, this ability of the European Union to drop these rules at a time when we needed to not to have them. That was the first thing, and the EU was very reactive in that. The second thing is, so all the governments made stimulus plans, fiscal spendings, but the EU added its own fiscal spending. And the EU is not done for that. The EU has a very small budget, and the EU has a solidarity, which is what we call the cohesion programs, where rich member states help on the long term poorer member states. But the EU has never been equipped to do a recovery response on an economic basis. And here the head leaders of the EU met at the end of April, and they endorsed it at the beginning of May, and they decided of a package of 540 billion euros to support workers, to support companies, and to support member states everywhere in Europe in the framework of this pandemic. And this is totally new. Of course, there are debates about how it's done. Some countries had different views. Perhaps we can come back to this during the questions. We used to help governments the European Stability Mechanism. This is technical, so I won't get into the details. But many comments in the press was, is the glass half full or half empty? Well, in fact, and that's my third point on the budgetary policy, the question today is not if the glass is it full or empty. What we are doing is we are increasing the size of the glass, because the leaders decided to add to these 540 billion euros a recovery fund of €1.5 trillion. And this is what is being discussed right now in Brussels. And that's huge, because what it means is that you are transforming the DNA of the EU itself. Because with such a fiscal stimulus at EU level and a solidarity between states, the EU is transforming itself into something way closer to a federation. So I will end this presentation by the idea that this crisis may at the end represent an opportunity for the European Union. It may lead to fundamentally different policies, and perhaps at the end we'll have a very effective monetary policy, but we'll also have a way more effective and powerful budgetary policy. Winston Churchill used to say, never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, the COVID crisis will have profound consequences on the European Union. And in history, it has always been during crisis that the EU reached new steps in its integration. So let me just sum up by 3 questions before your questions. Did the EU do enough from a health perspective? Most surely not. But which state in the world can say it did? But one thing is sure, the EU did more than it was supposed to do in terms of its own competence. Second question, would have we been better equipped without the EU to tackle the economic crisis? Certainly not, because the EU currency and the European Central Bank largely saved us from a rise of interest rates in several of the most hurt countries in Europe. And we've already set a first stimulus package at EU level that is extremely useful. Third question, will the EU be able to meet the moment in terms of solidarity between member states? Well, we don't know yet. This is what is being discussed in Brussels. It is, we will see in the coming weeks. But it's very, very important for the future of the European Union and our future as well. I encourage you to follow the news about what's happening right now, because I am pretty sure that this crisis will open a new chapter of European integration.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. So I will, while we are waiting, don't forget, you can send us your questions under the Q&A, and then I can ask them, address them to the Consul General. I have a question because, and I agree with you, and you know, I followed a lot of the situation in Europe, and at the very recently, actually, we saw these workers from Eastern Europe coming, you know, Germany opened a little bit, even France, Spain. So we saw the solidarity, basically. We understood that the economy within the European Union is European, so people had to finally to travel. At the very beginning, French workers were panicked that they cannot work in Germany and so on. And now we saw, Germany organized charters, France as well, etc. So there is this question of borders, and you know very well, it's very political. In social sciences, we speak, and humanities, we speak a lot of imagined borders, and I'm very sure that you know as well. And that was an obsession during the 20th century, right, with Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and now we try to open a little bit the borders, but there is still the Schengen space. And what I saw and we saw right now, basically with the pandemics, we have the tendency to close the borders, the real ones and the imaginary ones. So yes, I hear you when you speak about solidarity, but then on the other side, I want to address you this question. Do you think there is a risk because of the pandemics, the coronavirus, to basically have the borders even more closed, and this solidarity, how exactly do you see it? Because people, they are afraid. We are afraid now of Eastern Europeans who will bring the virus in Germany. And
no, that's a very good question, because I didn't raise the topic of the Schengen Agreement. And the Schengen Agreement is something we are very attached to. It's the fact that you can travel throughout the European Union, through the Schengen Agreement countries, without customs and without having to stop at the border to show your passport. Of course, when you have a pandemic with a virus, you need to prevent people from traveling with the disease from point A to point B. And for example, in France, we decided not only shelter in place, and it was relaxed 2 days ago, but we also prohibited transportation beyond 100 kilometers. That's a way to help confine the disease when you have a new fire somewhere that it is not going to burn in another region. So one way to reduce these moves was to close the borders. So not only we closed the exterior borders of Schengen, but we also closed all the borders inside Schengen. And for the way we see the European Union, that was terrifying. That was not something we would expect to do one day, but the virus made it necessary. Now we are reopening the interior borders. So for the moment, for example, we have workers from Eastern Europe who are back to France. You know, we are a very important agricultural power, and we need workers, seasonal workers, and so they are now back to France. And the European Commission, no later than today, made a presentation to see how we can reopen all these interior borders before summer, also to save the touristic season, to allow people to go from one country to the other. So my hope is that at the end of the epidemic, all these borders will be open again. Of course, when you start closing them, there's always a risk that you don't come back to the initial point. But the Schengen Agreement is so much in the DNA of Europe that I'm pretty confident it will come back to the normal situation.
We have two questions related to tourism.
Please.
It's expected. So is there anything to predict about travel and tourism? And someone is even more direct. They say, do you have an idea when Americans will be allowed back in France?
I don't have a crystal ball, and it will depend on the evolution of the virus. The situation right now is that people in the United States cannot go to Schengen, except if they are from a nationality of one country of the European Union, and they go back home if they live there, or if they have a family or professional reason to go to France or Germany or Italy. So if you're an American citizen, you cannot go to France right now. This rule is going to be until at least June 15th. The EU will reconsider, and if the pandemic is still bad and if the virus still circulates, we will expand this, and so it would be a catastrophe for the touristic season. There is a chance that perhaps the pandemic will ease and that we'll be able to relax this. You know, the same rule goes in the other direction, and that people cannot come from the Schengen zone to the United States. And we hope as well that this, if the pandemic eases, will change.
Very interesting question. Where did the trillions for the recovery fund come from?
That's a great question. Two ways to answer it. First, it comes from every country. So every country pulls its money into the pot, and then we share the money in a differentiated way. So countries who need more will take more than countries who don't need. So if you're a country, for example, who is really in a difficult situation, you give 15% because your GDP is 15% of the GDP of the EU, but you might benefit 30%, just figures like that. So that's the way it works. Another way to answer this question is, how do you raise this money? Because you can, and that's the whole debate, can you raise money on the markets? So can you do bonds? That is what people call Corona bonds. So could we pool our financial credibility at European level to raise money together in the financial markets, whereas raising the money country by country? This is exactly what's being discussed in Brussels.
I have a question somehow related, actually two persons. Someone, so she's originally from UK, and we had a second question about the Brexit situation. The question is, if you believe that Britain would be in a better position to address the COVID situation if they were still a member of the European Union.
So the French government had a very clear position when the British voted in favor of Brexit. We were not in favor of Brexit, and we think that Brexit is a bad decision for the UK and for the rest of Europe. For one reason, which is we consider that in today's world, which is a world of very, very, very tough competition between states, you need to be big in order to win some trade battles or political battles or economic battles in the world, in front of China, in front of the United States, in front of many other countries. And so you're stronger when you're 350 million than when you're 50 or 70 million. And this is true for everything. And this is true as well to tackle a crisis like the one we have today, the economic crisis of today. So our position is that, yes, as I say, without the EU, the economic crisis would be way bigger for France. We think that to be part of the EU is you're better situated to tackle this crisis when you're part of the EU rather than when you're a country separated from the EU. And just one thing, sometimes people tell me, but Switzerland is not part of the EU, but Norway is not part of the EU. Well, you know, even before Brexit, Switzerland was some way closer to the EU than the UK, because the UK was part of the EU, but with a lot of opt-outs. It was not in Schengen, it was not in the euro currency, and so on. Switzerland was outside and Norway was outside, but with many opts-in. It was, for example, Switzerland is in the Schengen Agreement. Normally, before the pandemic, you travel from France to Switzerland and then to Germany without stopping at border and without showing your passport. So, and you see today that these countries coordinate a lot. Just one example, here in San Francisco, we have 13 consuls from the European Union, and we have one meeting by Zoom a week. Well, we invite our Swiss colleague and our Norway colleague to every of these meetings, and it's very useful.
I have an interesting question here. So, you know, with all the measures that have been taken in Europe and here, this person asks, you know, inquires about the risk that the coronavirus could pose in Europe, in certain countries, in the rise of authoritarianism. And, you know, I would quote certainly Hungary, but Poland a little bit. What do you think about that?
Now, that's a very important question. I could have addressed it in my presentation, but since it's short, it's like Schengen, I had to pick some topics. It's, you know, populism is on the rise everywhere. And so there is a very dangerous mix when you have a rise of populism and a situation where governments have to take extraordinary measures that hurt our liberties, our freedoms. Because to fight a pandemic, as I said before, you have, for example, to reduce the liberty to come and go on a temporary basis. And every country does it. The problem is that in some countries with populist governments, if you have the two together, you have the risk that this will continue for good. My conviction is that with the EU, every country agreed to a set of principles. And if the country doesn't respect its word to follow these principles, then politically, the Commission can act against this country, and legally, the citizens can go to the European Court of Justice to complain about the liberties, the freedoms that they don't have anymore, and that are not in line with the EU requirements. So being part of the EU is a kind of insurance for the citizens that the EU principles in terms of human rights and fundamental liberties will be respected.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here about the situation in Europe, in the European Union and the US. And the question is, how do you compare the manner in which the European Union has managed the crisis with what the US has done?
It's very hard to compare. You know, everyone uses the same tools, that is to say, shelter in place, stay at home, help the local authorities get testing capacity, protective equipment, help the hospitals increase their capacity. And we are all struggling because some protective equipment, for example, was scarce at the beginning of the crisis. So it's very hard to compare also because you're comparing two animals, if I can say, that are from a different breed. You know, the US is a federation, so with a strong power in Washington, D.C., then the governors, then the local authorities. From a health perspective, as I explained, the EU has no competence. And it's then the states who have very strong competence in some cases. And in some states which are federations like Germany, it's more of the federated states like the Länder in Germany. So it's really very difficult to compare.
Mm-hmm. One last question in English, and then I will ask you something in French, because we have a question, it has to be addressed. to reassure the French citizens here. So the last one in English. So someone's talk, and you and I and everyone knows that within Europe, the European Union, we have countries that struggle more and struggled even before from an economic point of view, and the political and all these Eastern European countries in transition. So the question is, what will happen with the recovery from the healthcare crisis? Because actually we will have two systems. We will have the Western countries with more resources. And you talked a little bit about this common budget and all the politics.
This is why we need solidarity. Jacques Delors said, Jacques Delors is a former president of the European Commission, and he said it is an existential moment for the European Union, because if we don't show solidarity between countries who were perhaps not hurt by the pandemic as much as some other countries do, or had more means to tackle the crisis than our other countries, then the EU could just disappear. And that's why I think that the EU is going to implement these recovery fund and improve its budgetary policy tools. Now, what's very interesting is that you have very different situations. Take two countries like Italy and Greece. Italy and Greece have a high debt, and so a difficulty to raise money on financial markets. Now, the way the crisis hurt these two countries is totally different, because Italy suffered a lot from the virus, Greece not that much. But Greece is going to suffer a lot from the lack of tourists, because tourism in Greece is even more important in its economy than it is in Italy. So all these countries are going to be hurt in a different way. And that's the real challenge when you have an asymmetrical shock to a bloc. And this is why we need this solidarity between what you call Western countries and other countries.
So the last question, it was asked in English, but it concerns a lot the French citizens here. Are there French citizens here in Seattle who can go home?
Comme je le disais tout à l'heure, tous les Français qui étaient touristes aux États-Unis ont pu rentrer en France. Chaque personne dont le domicile principal est en France, que ce soit un Français, mais aussi un Américain qui a un visa permanent en France, peut rentrer en France. Ces gens-là, ils sont maintenant partis. Les touristes, c'était au début de la crise. Aujourd'hui, on a la communauté française, les gens qui sont établis, par exemple, à Seattle. Aujourd'hui, pour rentrer en France, il faut avoir ce qu'on appelle un motif impérieux, c'est-à-dire une nécessité familiale ou professionnelle de rentrer en France. Et quelque part, c'est l'application pour la communauté expatriée de la règle des 100 km. Aujourd'hui, si vous êtes en Normandie et que vous voulez aller voir votre famille en Bourgogne, vous ne pouvez pas parce que c'est à plus de 100 km. C'est la même chose quand vous êtes français de Seattle, vous ne pouvez pas, sauf raison impérieuse, vous rendre sur le territoire national. Ces règles vont évoluer avec le temps et je m'adresse aux Français qui nous écoutent. Nous vous envoyons des emails réguliers pour vous informer de la situation. Nous allons continuer pour que vous puissiez progressivement être au courant de l'évolution du cadre juridique pour pouvoir voir si vous pourrez rentrer en France, voir la famille dans les mois qui viennent.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to hear you and to chat with you. And I'm sure we have everyone thanks you for having taken the time to be with us. Merci beaucoup. Bon travail. Stay safe, everyone. And we see each other in 2 weeks when we welcome Viviane Hua, the director of the Northwest Film Forum here in Seattle. Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Au revoir.
Au revoir à tous. Merci.
Au revoir.